If you implement what I'm about to talk about, your running will dramatically improve over time, especially if you've never done any work when it comes to cadence. I had someone ask about this, and I used to have shin splints and runner's knee and those injuries, and now I run ultras. I did a 212-mile week. I've done 10 marathons in 10 days and avoided injuries for the most part. And so the cadence is one of the things that if you just focus on this, your running will get better and you'll feel better. And I want to give 3 reasons why that's helpful and why you need to work on your cadence, and then give you some tips on how to practice it, because that's another part of this is it's hard to implement and you have to stay very conscious. But hopefully with this video you realize how beneficial it is, and so it'll be more front of mind when you run. Let's talk about cadence for a second. So generally, what is kind of recommended, everybody is different, but generally a higher cadence around 180. And what that means is every step, so right and left, each step is put into that. So 180 cadence is 180 steps per minute, so that's 90 each side in a minute. And the reason why, well, I'll get to that in a second, but as you look at your cadence, you want to see if it's like a lower number, like 150, 160, because a lot of people do that because they extend their legs and they feel like they need to reach, which we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But that's unproductive, can increase your risk of injury. It's not efficient. And so getting a higher cadence typically is better. Now, it's hard to run a 190 cadence when you're doing 13-minute miles, right? So you have to kind of figure out where you're at depending on the pace you're running, but generally a higher cadence is better. And so let's talk about why now, and then we'll get into tips on how to practice this. So first off, the simplest, easiest thing that this helps with is it reduces your risk of injury. And I'm going to try and explain this. I couldn't find a picture to post in this video to demonstrate online, but hopefully my explanation makes sense. I had to practice it a little bit. So if we think about shapes for a second, let's go back to geometry in school. If you think about a triangle, 3 sides, square, 4 sides, and then you get up to like a decagon or more, whatever those ones are called. I didn't get that far, but a decagon is 10 sides, right? And if you think about a perfect circle, right, there's no impact when it touches as it rolls, if that makes sense. So with a triangle, if it's flat and you got the 2 sides and you pick one side up and let it drop down to the next corner, then that's a big arc that it has to follow to hit the ground with more impact. Versus if you have a decagon with 10 sides, there's not as many it's not as far from each point. So when you roll it or you lift it up, the next side is already there. And so it rolls smoother, and there's less of this arc from the point up here dropping down with a triangle or like a square. And so it's the idea of there's less impact because you're not taking as long and as big of an arc, if you will, to step, if that makes sense. And the problem with when you stretch out like your stride or it's a lower cadence is you tend to hit with your heel. And so if I'm taking a step from here to here, as my leg arches, I have my heel, it's going to hit the ground more likely that way, versus if you have smaller steps, you're able to get the front of your foot underneath you. And so hopefully that explanation makes sense, because the idea is there's less of this like forward movement and this like stretch to where your leg hits the ground or your foot hits the ground harder. And so the idea is a faster cadence, more steps. It's going to reduce your injury because you're not getting as much impact when you have a higher cadence. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about is power. And I've never really measured this specifically for myself, but just intuitively feeling into my run. If I am keeping my feet underneath me with a higher cadence, I'm able to push off more regularly. So think about a 150 cadence versus a 180. Well, if I get 30 more steps per minute, that's 30 more steps that I'm pushing myself forward. And so again, there's a lot of variables like pace or maybe the grade of elevation you're running, right? But the more steps I'm going to get more power. I'm getting more opportunities where my foot pushes off the ground. And so I think this is helpful in the sense of like you can just run faster or harder. Now there's other elements to strength, right? Like going to the gym or being used to the volume you're running or used to the pace, right? But I get more steps at 180, which is more movement forward in my opinion, which rolls us into this. The third point is efficiency. It's just more efficient. Opposed to having to stretch and reach and, kind of drive your legs super far, it's kind of like just little steps, if that makes sense. And again, depending on pace, but little steps that it's just more efficient. Even though it's more and you do have to practice cadence, it's just you don't have to stretch and reach and push as far when you reach out with a 150 cadence versus a 180 or 200. And so it keeps you more efficient. And running is all about efficiency, right? Like if you're running a half marathon, whatever distance, you want to be as efficient as possible. And so you're not using as much energy compared to when you're inefficient. So then you have a better time and you run faster. And you're just, like I talked about earlier, less likely to have injury. You reduce your injury risk. So those are why you should work on your cadence. A lot of watches can tell you when, like, roughly what your cadence is, because, your arm swing and moving back and forth. It's not the most accurate. You can get things like power meters that will be more accurate with that you can clip onto your shoe. I've never used one. I just am kind of a little bit more in tuned. But if I'm slower, I might be running a 160, 170 cadence versus if I'm running tempo or faster miles, I'm getting up into 180, 190. So it definitely varies. Now, a lot of people feel like they're hopping up and down, which is also inefficient. So if you're like stepping and bouncing up, that's not efficient, right? Because we're running forward. We're not running up. And so a big problem I think people need to address when they're working on this is that they land more on the front of their foot, maybe not necessarily all the way on your toes, but more the ball or mid of your foot, and you're leaning forward, which again is really hard to do if you're going at a much slower pace. But if you're bouncing up and down, that's not efficient either. And so you're taking all this kinetic energy up and then landing down in your foot versus you're kind of rolling yourself forward when you have proper form in a way. So that's important, but let's talk about tips to practice this because it just takes time to get that muscle memory. It took me time. There's still times, especially when I'm tired after in a longer run, where I'm kind of letting my cadence go. So I'm increasing my risk of injury, less power, less efficient, right? So one way to work on this, I like, and this is something that helped me, is running down hills more. Or when you're running down hills, you pay attention to this more. And the reason why that is it's just easier to get your foot in front of you as opposed to going uphill or on a flat. And the way I think about it is I kick my heel up. So I don't want to over exaggerate it, but as my foot's hitting the ground, I'm sending my heel back because I have to be quick enough because my next foot's hitting the ground already. So then I alternate, right? It's kind of like kicking your heel up, and think of kind of in a way shorter steps. I've had a lot of people, there was this one kid in high school that was like, take longer strides downhill. I don't necessarily agree with that because then I have to stretch and reach, and it's hard to get the bottom of my foot more on the ball of my feet as I'm running, if that makes sense. So I like the quicker steps, again, more opportunities for my feet to hit the ground and propel me forward. So I like practicing this stuff downhill because it's easier and you can just kind of flick your heel back, if that makes sense, when you're going downhill. And so you're getting more steps. But I think the biggest thing is just reminding yourself of this. Like if you're going for a 4-mile run or whatever it is and you're trying to work on your cadence, forget pace, forget like what heart rate you're trying to get into, what the workout is. Just do a workout with cadence, meaning you're working on your cadence and trying to figure it out. Let go of time, because that's a big part of it. Is like if you bounce back between on my cadence, but I'm slowing down because you're having to focus on something else opposed to going harder, that's fine because you're going to work on cadence and it's going to benefit you in the long run. So just do a cadence workout, whether it's 2 miles or whatever, where the only thing you care about is trying to feel out the form. And again, everybody's different. You might have to learn how to do more of a toe or midfoot strike compared to a heel strike. So I probably need to make a video on that. But when you're working on cadence, I think a lot of people find that they have to change the way their foot lands. And so I would look up like toe strike versus heel strike. You can find that on YouTube. There's plenty of videos that I've watched on that. So hopefully that helps, gives you a little bit of perspective of why this is important and how it benefits you, and gives you some tips on how to start implementing it. If you like running content, my name's Reese. I'm ultimately just trying to help people enjoy their relationship with running more and deepen it. It is a very personal practice in my opinion, and I want to help people get their PRs, reduce their injuries, and I've learned a lot through running. So if you like content like that, consider subscribing. If not, either way, I still hope you got something out of this video, because that accomplishes my goal and mission. So other than that, I hope I see you in another video sometime soon. Peace.